T-Tube, March 9, 2020. T-Tube is the voice for the voiceless. Subscribe, share and comment us. Your comments are important for the improvement of our programs. Today we have come with several programs focused on the violation of women and reports of March 8, human rights abuses, mass bombardments, siege, and Tigray genocide. Ethnic cleansing etc. by Ethiopian Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki, the Amhara and their allied powers. Headlines: IWD 2022, 15 women's organizations call on UN for vital services to sexual violence survivors in Tigray. UN rights chief says air strikes have killed hundreds since November in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is falling apart, but Abiy still has a choice. By allowing the much-needed aid to reach starving Tigrayans, the Ethiopian Prime Minister may not only save tens of thousands of lives but also prevent his country's disintegration. Alex Duval. Al Jazeera. 1 July 2021.
We're here to make you HIV positive. Hundreds of women rush to Tigray hospitals as soldiers use rape as weapon of war. Doctors say victims of conflict-related sexual violence are seeking emergency contraception and HIV prevention drugs in northern Ethiopia. By Lucy Kassa and Anna Puyol-Matsini, 27 March 2021. Human Rights Council marks International Women's Day and concludes interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, women trace the outlines of peace. The Christian Science Monitor. Even as war continues, civil society groups and international human rights lawyers seek post-conflict healing based on the rights of the most vulnerable. Like wars in Europe, conflicts closer to home affect us. Ordinary Africans need our care too. Daily Maverick. 8 March 2022.
IWD 2022, 15 women's organizations call on UN for vital services to sexual violence survivors in Tigray. Addis Standard. March 8, 2022. In connection with the International Women's Day, a group of 15 women's organizations appealed to Pramila Patten, United Nations Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict and Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, for service provision for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray. The group, that includes African women's rights advocates, Black women radicals, Choose Yourself, Global Justice Center, Global Network of Women Peace Builders, and Global Society of Tigrayan Scholars Gender Task Team, among others, requested for a response to the ongoing siege imposed by the federal government on the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Tens of thousands of survivors of well-documented weaponized rape and conflict-related sexual violence (CRSV) remain unseen, unheard, and the extreme violence done to them is erased, as if it does not matter. This cannot be allowed, the group said, and pleaded with Patten to recognize, listen to, and help the women and girls of Tigray who have thus far been rendered invisible and inaccessible and who have been denied all basic services. Full statement in PDF. Service provision for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray. Your Excellency, we the undersigned are writing to you at this time in accordance with the landmark United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 S. Res. 1325 on women, security, and peace, adopted in 2000 that calls on all parties to the conflict to respect fully international law applicable to the rights and protections of women and girls, in particular the obligations applicable to them under the Geneva Convention of 1949 and the additional protocols, to request for a response to the ongoing siege imposed by the federal government on the Tigray region of Ethiopia. This siege, characterized by a total blockade of essential services and life-saving humanitarian supplies, has been predictably devastating to the civilian population of Tigray and even more particularly so to the survivors of brutal weaponized rape. Amnesty International 2021, who have been denied urgent post-rape care as a result. Human Rights Watch 2021. Even more alarming, domestic ability to provide support for survivors is curtailed completely as a result of the deliberate devastation of the Tigrayan healthcare system by Ethiopian and allied forces during active conflict, and because even the most basic healthcare supplies are no longer available in Tigray. Mark Clarfield et al. 2022. In spite of extensive documentation of both the extent to which rape has been deployed as a weapon of war in Tigray and the double victimization of survivors through deliberate denial of critical medical and mental health support, there is yet to be a concerted effort by the international community to adopt appropriate steps as per UNSC Resolution 1820 (1820 Seychelles rupees The United Nations organizations that have the most significant networks on the ground have also, thus far, failed to establish mechanisms to appropriately monitor, document, and address conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray, leaving survivors of brutal rape with no services. Tens of thousands of survivors of well-documented weaponized rape and conflict-related sexual violence (CRSV) remain unseen, unheard, and the extreme violence done to them is erased, as if it does not matter. This cannot be allowed. It is with this in mind that we are asking you to join our call for Filled Circle the UNSC to put into effect Resolutions 1325 and 1820 to ensure unfettered humanitarian access and protection for the women and girls of Tigray from egregious human rights violations and sexual violence still ongoing in the Tigrayan territories that remain occupied by Amhara, ENDF, Somalia and Eritrean forces. Filled Circle concerted commitment by the international community to end the devastating siege and humanitarian blockade imposed by the Ethiopian government and ensure the restoration of services including healthcare and psychosocial support for survivors of CRSV. Filled Circle urgent and unfettered humanitarian access to all parts of Tigray to reach the civilian population of Tigray, 83% of whom are currently facing acute food insecurity with more than 1 million people in active famine. Filled Circle prioritization of Tigray and the enactment of the recommendations listed by the Secretary General of the United Nations, United Nations 2022, specifically in regard to ensuring adequate funding for comprehensive and quality multi-sectoral assistance and protection for survivors of CRSV and children. Filled Circle urge respect for international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict and support efforts towards ceasefire. Your Excellency, we plead with you today to recognize, listen to, and help the women and girls of Tigray who have thus far been rendered invisible and inaccessible and who have been denied all basic services. It is imperative for the international community to come together to promote human dignity, human rights, and best practices to ensure sustainable and enduring peace by acknowledging and addressing the victims of conflict. We aver our commitment to support all efforts to support the goals outlined herein and would appreciate the opportunity to engage directly to discuss these issues further. Signatories: African women's rights advocates, Black women radicals, Choose Yourself, Global Justice Center, Global Network of Women Peacebuilders, Global Society of Tigrayan Scholars, Gender Task Team, Mukwege Foundation, Nadia's Initiative, Raising Voices, Rescue Tigray Rape Victims, Tigray's Women Association of UK Voice, Amplified Women of Tigray, Women's International Peace Center, Women's Rights Watch, Yala Feminists. UN Rights Chief says air strikes have killed hundreds since November in Ethiopia. Geneva, March 7. Reuters: the UN Human Rights Chief said on Monday the situation in northern Ethiopia had deteriorated since November and her office had received reports of widespread violations including rapes and lethal airstrikes. Michelle Bachelet told the Geneva-based Human Rights Council her staff had recorded 304 deaths only in 1 month and injuries to 373 people in air attacks in Tigray, apparently carried out by the Ethiopian Air Force in Tigray and Afar regions. The government of Abiy has regularly denied targeting civilians in the 16-month-old war pitting Ethiopia's federal forces against rebellious forces of the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF). Note that TDF has no any air force. Abiy's regime is lying a big lie. Ethiopia's envoy to the Human Rights Council, Marlet Haile Gwadi, dismissed Bachelet's statement on Monday, saying it was at variance with the facts on the ground. Ethiopia abides by its national and international human rights obligations, Marlet said. Ethiopia's military spokesman, Colonel Getnet Adane, and government spokesman Legesse Tulu did not immediately respond to requests for comment. In the same speech, Bachelet said her office had received reports of 306 rapes by Tigrayan forces in the Amhara region in November to December 2021. Reuters has interviewed women in the Amhara region who have described gang rapes by ENDF, Amhara and Eritrean forces but forced to lie as if she has raped by Tigrayan forces. TPLF spokesman Getachew Reda said he could not comment on what he called blanket allegations. Abiy is known for deceptive and lies and corruption. Even he corrupted PhD. Whatever it is, Abiy is liable on the alleged human rights violations all over the country, because he invited foreigner and invaded Tigray, which leads to Tigray genocide, and complete civil war in the country. Whatever the merits of such allegations though, we are open for independent investigation into these and other similar allegations, he added. Aid workers say civilians have been killed in several airstrikes, including a bombing on the night when Ethiopian Orthodox Christians celebrate Christmas Eve in the town of Dedabit, in northwest Tigray near the border with Eritrea in January. Ethiopia's government and military did not respond to requests for comment on those reports at the time. Reporting by Emma Farge and Julia Paravicini, editing by Hugh Lawson and Andrew Hevins. Our standards, the Thomson Reuters Trust Principles. Ethiopia is falling apart, but Abiy still has a choice by allowing the much-needed aid to reach starving Tigrayans. The Ethiopian Prime Minister may not only save tens of thousands of lives but also prevent his country's disintegration. Alex Duval. Al Jazeera, 1 July 2021. Getting aid to the starving in the Tigray region of Ethiopia is not just about saving lives, it is about whether Ethiopia will stay together as a country or disintegrate. When the Ethiopian army fled from the Tigrayan capital Mekelle on Monday, it left the region in the hands of the fighters of the Tigray Defense Forces or TDF, the armed wing of the former governing party, the Tigray People's Liberation Front or TPLF. Of Tigray's 6 million people, more than 5 million need emergency assistance and, according to the United Nations, 350,000 are already in famine conditions. Preschool children are most at risk, as their small bodies are unable to last long without essential nutrients. An estimated 30,000 children could perish from hunger over the next few months. And if the aid effort is not resumed, and stepped up, that death toll could easily be 10 times higher. Before abandoning Mekelle, the retreating Ethiopian troops ransacked aid compounds and took all the money from the banks. They also stole communications equipment from the aid agencies. The incoming TDF found a city without even a single day's supply of food in store. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced what he called a humanitarian ceasefire. It made for a good headline, but his statements over the last weeks have made clear that it is no such thing. In fact, he plans to pursue war by other means: blockade. In one speech, reported on June 25, he accused aid agencies of having a hidden agenda of supplying the rebels. Almost immediately, 3 staff members from the international medical charity Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, or MSF, were murdered. The killers are not known, but the finger of suspicion points at the government. The announcement of the humanitarian ceasefire limited the pause in the army's offensive action to the farming season, which lasts just 3 months. That is just enough time to buy new weapons and, Abiy has promised, return to Tigray by force of arms. A ceasefire is usually an agreement between the fighting parties, but this announcement referred to the TPLF as a criminal junta. And speaking on June 30, Abiy was candid that the war was now fought against the people of Tigray, who he said had stabbed the army in the back by siding with the TDF. They will now have time to understand their situation, he said. What he means is that he will blockade Tigray and starve the people into submission. Hunger is a particularly hideous weapon. The anguish of parents watching helplessly as their young children waste away is almost as terrible as the pains of starvation suffered by those children themselves. The memory of famine haunts people for generations afterwards, leaving a long smoldering hatred of those who inflicted the pain. Ireland's Great Hunger of 1845–51 nurtured the country's independence struggle. Ukraine's Holodomor, Stalin's campaign of starvation in the 1930s, left many Ukrainians believing they could never be part of the same state as Russia. Abiy has a choice. He can decide to allow an international humanitarian effort to go ahead in Tigray. This would mean allowing aid convoys to travel along the roads and relief flights to land in Mekelle and the other airports in the region. That could stop the slide into famine and save hundreds of thousands of lives. Allowing humanitarian access would also be the first step towards reassuring Tigrayans that, whatever the political differences between the federal government and the TPLF, they are still valued as Ethiopian citizens. Tightening the blockade sends an altogether different message: your government wants to kill you by starvation.
The TDF is well armed and highly motivated, its young fighters driven by anger at the atrocities inflicted on them. They have just won a series of stunning military victories and acquired a huge arsenal. If aid does not reach them from Ethiopia, they will for sure look for another way to get it. The obvious option is to launch an offensive and clear a road to Sudan so that there can be an unofficial cross-border aid operation. International aid donors are considering that as a last-ditch option because it is unconscionable for a man-made famine on this scale to unfold while nothing is done to stop it. But they also know that a cross-border operation would have political consequences. It would cut Tigray's umbilical cord with Ethiopia. Tigrayans are so angry at the rape, killing, pillage and starvation inflicted upon them, and government-incited hate speech in the media, that they are demanding independence. Their leaders know this is a hazardous path and want to keep open the possibility of a negotiated settlement that keeps them part of Ethiopia, probably with some form of increased regional autonomy. Abiy's decision over the next few days may decide which route is taken: humanitarian access and a country that could hold together, or a starvation blockade and national disintegration. Compassion for starving children in Tigray and caring about Ethiopia's future as a single country come down to the same single choice. A small child's body wastes away fast. It is not long for Abiy to choose his path. Remember, Tigrayans have never been defeated in history. It is Tigrayans' skill of war saved Ethiopia from colony. We're here to make you HIV positive. Hundreds of women rush to Tigray hospitals as soldiers use rape as weapon of war. Doctors say victims of conflict-related sexual violence are seeking emergency contraception and HIV prevention drugs in northern Ethiopia. By Lucy Kasser and Anna Puyol-Matsini, 27 March 2021. We're here to make you HIV positive. Hundreds of women rush to Tigray hospitals as soldiers use rape as weapon of war. Doctors say victims of conflict-related sexual violence are seeking emergency contraception and HIV prevention drugs in northern Ethiopia. By Lucy Kasser and Anna Puyol-Matsini, 27 March 2021. Hundreds of women are rushing to Tigray's hospitals in northern Ethiopia for emergency contraception and HIV prevention drugs after being systematically raped, often gang-raped, by Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers fighting in a brutal civil war. Dozens are seeking abortions, medical care and psychological support in overwhelmed hospitals, many of which have been destroyed by a 5-month conflict between Ethiopia's federal government in collaboration with Eritrea, Somalia and allied forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front (TPLF). Thousands more are thought to be suffering in silence as they fear reprisals by security forces and rejection from their families, survivors, doctors and aid workers told The Telegraph. In one of the first in-depth investigations of allegations of rape as a weapon of war in the conflict, which would constitute a war crime, The Telegraph has spoken to dozens in the region to uncover the true extent of what is happening. One video, which was widely circulated on social media and has been verified by The Telegraph, shows a surgeon in Adigrat Hospital removing long nails and pieces of plastic from the vagina of one woman after she was raped and tortured. Malat, 20, was at home in Wukro with her elder brother Danae*, when Ethiopian federal soldiers came in, she said. When 5 Ethiopian soldiers came to our house to rape me, Danae tried to defend me from them. I cannot let you rape my sister, he said to them. The soldiers shot my brother in the head and took turns raping me, Malat recalled, still in shock. They raped me beside the corpse of my brother. Like many Tigrayan women, she is now pregnant from the attack. Many others have contracted HIV or other sexually transmitted diseases. Ethiopian and Eritrean forces have for months been battling troops loyal to the former Tigrayan regional government in a war that has left thousands dead and millions on the brink of starvation. The resulting humanitarian disaster has left 4.5 million people in need of emergency assistance. A coalition of Tigray's political opposition recently stated that more than 50,000 people might have died since fighting began on November 4. Survivors, doctors, aid workers and experts speaking to The Telegraph all pointed to rape being systematically used as a weapon of war by Ethiopian and Eritrean forces despite being harassed and threatened by soldiers in a bid to prevent them from speaking out. It's absolutely ethnic cleansing. Rape is being used as a weapon of war, it is being used as scare tactics, an aid worker who has just returned from Tigray, who asked to stay anonymous, said. Selim, a 26-year-old coffee seller in Edaga Hamas, 100 kilometers away from Tigray's capital of Mekelle, said she was abducted by Eritrean soldiers with 17 other women in January. They took us into the forest. When we arrived there were around 100 soldiers who were waiting for us. They tied the hands and feet of each one of us. And then they raped us without mercy, she told The Telegraph as she fought through tears. We stayed that way for 3 days. After 3 days the soldiers killed 5 girls who had been tied with us. They poured alcohol over our wounds. They danced standing over us. By the time she was taken into the forest, she had already been raped several times by men she recognized as Eritrean soldiers. After the first attack, her abusers were waiting for her as she returned to her house from the hospital with contraceptives and post-exposure HIV drugs. Why the hell did you want this? We want you to be sick. That is what we are here for. We are here to make you HIV positive, Selim recalled one of the men as saying. A doctor working in the sprawling Hamdiyet refugee camp at the Sudanese border also said several women had reported being raped by Amharan soldiers who told them they planned to ethnically cleanse Tigray. The women that have been raped say that the things that they say to them when they were raping them is that they need to change their identity, to either Amharize them or at least leave their Tigrinya status, and that they've come there to cleanse them, to cleanse the bloodline, Dr. Tedros Tefera told CNN. Practically this has been a genocide, he added. The systematic nature of the sexual violence and its reported use as a deliberate weapon of war could constitute war crimes under international law. Abra Desta, who heads the Social Affairs Department of the Tigray interim government, declined to comment on the worsening sexual violence in the conflict between Ethiopian and Eritrean forces and troops loyal to the former Tigrayan regional government. However, earlier this week Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed acknowledged the abuses. There were atrocities that were committed in Tigray region. Reports indicate that atrocities were being committed by raping women and looting properties, Mr. Abiy said, without attributing the incidents to particular groups. Any member of the national defense who committed rape and looting against our Tigrayan sisters will be held accountable, he added. In response to the Telegraph's specific allegations, Mr. Abiy's spokeswoman Bilene Sayum said the Prime Minister had sufficiently addressed this in Parliament. The government does not condone sexual violence or any form of violence against citizens, she added. Eritrea's Minister of Information Yemaine Gebremeskel told the Telegraph the accusations were sad and revolting. Eritrean soldiers have never been accused of rape. All the fabricated stories, which are alien to our culture and laws, are peddled to cover up the crimes of the TPLF which started the war. The government's statements followed condemnation from top UN officials including UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet and WHO Director Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who called for an independent investigation into conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray. One doctor in Adigrat Hospital in northern Tigray, who asked to remain anonymous for fear of reprisals, said 111 women had come to get abortions in the past 2 weeks alone after reporting being raped by soldiers. Since early December, major hospitals in Tigray have recorded 512 cases of sexual abuse by soldiers, most of which are gang rapes. But doctors and nurses from 2 Tigray hospitals who spoke to the Telegraph on condition of anonymity said the real figures could be significantly higher as a majority of the cases go unreported. Every woman who comes here says there were 20 and more women with her, who get no chance to make it to hospitals, Goitam, a doctor at a hospital in Mekelle said. Many hospitals have been destroyed in the fighting, leaving survivors struggling to access medical care and psychological support. Only one facility provides the full range of services for clinical management of rape survivors, and emergency contraception is fully available in less than half of the facilities assessed, the UN chief's statement said. Hospitals can also become places of danger for women who speak out about their experiences. Soldiers enter hospitals as they like. They cross wards and threaten patients, nurses and doctors. There were recently 7 raped women from Zalambesa who disappeared from their beds after seeing soldiers in the hospital, said Abraham, a doctor in Adigrat Hospital. Rahel, a nurse at a rehabilitation center for survivors of sexual violence, said officials from the transitional government in Tigray had threatened to shut down the center. They believe it is these centers which are making the stories of sexually abused women known to the world, she said. They don't want these stories out. Dr. Denis Mukwege, the Nobel Peace Prize-winning Congolese gynecologist, told the Telegraph rape as a weapon of war must be banned wherever it is reported. When rape is used, the world has to stand up and say no to rape as a weapon of war. But the world is not doing it strongly, it is not standing up. Some names have been changed. Additional reporting by Will Brown.
Human Rights Council marks International Women's Day and concludes interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. The 8th of March 2022, Federico Villegas, president of the Human Rights Council, said that discrimination against women was the oldest and the most persistent and massive violation of human rights. The Human Rights Council should assume its historic responsibility and be at the forefront of the fight for the promotion and protection of women's rights around the world. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, said that the climate and environmental crisis had had a particular impact on women around the world. Minority women, as well as migrants and women of African descent among others, were particularly vulnerable to these risks. Women faced intersecting cultural and economic factors that made him vulnerable to these risks. Finland, speaking on behalf of Mexico, Finland and 54 states, said that a backlash against women's and girls' rights and gender equality had been witnessed. Advancing gender equality was crucial to comply with human rights obligations but also key to enable peace and sustainable development. Center for Reproductive Rights said International Women's Day took its origins in the struggle of women in a society that did not recognize their agency or autonomy 100 years ago, and today women and girls were still seeking for their rights to be recognized, in particular those facing intersectional discrimination. The Council also concluded its interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on her oral update on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. The interactive dialogue started on Monday, the 7th of March, and a summary can be found here. In the discussion, speakers expressed concerns about the violation of human rights in Tigray, Amhara and Afar, including gender-based violence, and calls were made on all actors to respect international humanitarian law by Abiy Ahmed Ali and his mentor Isaias Afwerki and their allied powers. Speakers were gravely concerned that almost 1 million persons were facing human-made famine conditions. Further concerns were expressed about extrajudicial killings, forced displacements, violence against refugee camps and internally displaced persons, and the killing of humanitarian aid workers, amongst others. Other speakers welcomed the positive measures taken by Ethiopia. They denounced the targeting of Ethiopia under the pretext of the Tigray crisis. The Ethiopian people had the capacity to handle their internal affairs. The Council should be impartial, non-politicized and non-selective. Nadia al-Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, said in concluding remarks that she was encouraged by the parallel tracks established for follow-up to the joint report. Progress against impunity and redress for victims required sustained political will and also resources. Action must be taken to send a strong message to perpetrators, victims and survivors. The Office of the High Commissioner was working to operationalize the mandate they had been given. A start-up team was already in place. It was regrettable that the Advisory Committee on Budgetary Issues had advised a cut of 1/3, which would limit posts and capacities. Speaking in the discussion on Tigray was Philippines, United Nations Children's Fund, Venezuela, China, Cuba, Switzerland, Sri Lanka, Russian Federation, Australia, Canada, United States, United Kingdom, Albania, Eritrea, South Sudan, New Zealand, Malawi, Iran, Ireland, Sudan and Belgium. Also speaking were the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination, International Bar Association, Eastern Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project, Christian Solidarity Worldwide, Coordination des Associations et des Particuliers pour la Liberté de Conscience, Society for Threatened Peoples, and Organisation Internationale pour les Pays les Moins Avancés. The webcast of the Human Rights Council meetings can be found here. All meeting summaries can be found here. Documents and reports related to the Human Rights Council's 49th regular session can be found here. At 10 a.m., the Council will hear the presentation by the High Commissioner for Human Rights of her global oral update on the activities of her office, followed by the presentation of reports by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras and Cyprus, as well as an oral update on Eritrea, followed by a general debate. Statements on the occasion of International Women's Day. Federico Villegas, president of the Human Rights Council, said on the occasion of International Women's Day, he wished to take this opportunity to encourage all to commit themselves to supporting and protecting the rights of women everywhere. Discrimination against women was the oldest, and the most persistent and massive violation of human rights. The Human Rights Council should assume its historic responsibility and be at the forefront of the fight for the promotion and protection of women's rights around the world. Michelle Bachelet, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, noted that the climate and environmental crisis had had a particular impact on women around the world. Minority women, as well as migrants and women of African descent among others, were particularly vulnerable to these risks. Women faced intersecting cultural and economic factors that made him vulnerable to these risks. Across the globe, female human rights defenders continued to fight for the planetary crisis, and demand a seat at the negotiation table, despite facing obstructions. The inclusion of women had led to more effective climate policies across the world. In this work, the High Commissioner stood for a more just today and a more equal and just tomorrow. Finland, speaking on behalf of Mexico, Finland and 54 states, said that a backlash against women's and girls' rights and gender equality had been witnessed. Advancing gender equality was crucial to comply with human rights obligations but also key to enable peace and sustainable development. The COVID-19 crisis had exacerbated pre-existing gender-based discrimination and violence. It had also given rise to a second, nefarious, shadow pandemic of gender-based violence, particularly for women and girls living through humanitarian crises. The root causes of gender inequalities must be addressed. Center for Reproductive Rights said International Women's Day took its origins in the struggle of women in a society that did not recognize their agency or autonomy 100 years ago, and today women and girls were still seeking for their rights to be recognized, in particular those facing intersectional discrimination. The pandemic had led to an increase in gender-based violence and centered the threat on reproductive rights, with many states backpedaling and restricting access. As for women human rights defenders, there were constant threats to their work, life and well-being, and they were subjected to many human rights violations, often with no access to justice or accountability. Interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on her oral update on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. The interactive dialogue with United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Michelle Bachelet on her oral update on the situation of human rights in the Tigray region of Ethiopia started on Monday, the 7th of March, and a summary can be found here.
Discussion speakers expressed concerns about the violation of human rights in Tigray, Amhara and Afar, including gender-based violence, and calls were made on all actors to respect international humanitarian law. The need to hold to account perpetrators of human rights violations was highlighted. Calls were made to cease all hostilities, including aerial bombing. Justice and meaningful accountability were needed, hostilities must cease, and humanitarian access must be restored. Speakers were gravely concerned that almost 1 million persons were facing human-made famine conditions. Further concerns were expressed about extrajudicial killings, forced displacements, violence against refugee camps and internally displaced persons, and the killing of humanitarian aid workers, amongst others. The lifting of the state of emergency was welcome and calls were made to release the prisoners detained during the state of emergency, mainly following the mass detentions on the basis of ethnicity. Trends towards de-escalation were welcome as they offered the prospect of hope. However, for peace to take root, crimes committed during the conflict could not be left in the shadows. Other speakers commended the Ethiopian government for establishing an inter-ministerial task force to implement the recommendations of the joint investigation body that had already identified areas of concerns. They welcomed the positive measures taken by Ethiopia. The complex situation on the ground was showing signs of improvement, and speakers welcomed the national political will shown to improve the situation. The role of the Ethiopian Commission for Human Rights was noted and its impartiality highlighted. Some speakers denounced the targeting of Ethiopia under the pretext of the Tigray crisis and insisted that the mandate of the Council was not to target specific countries. The protection of citizens belonged to the Ethiopian state, and the Commission for National Reconciliation should be recognized as the only institution investigating violations. Some speakers urged the Council to terminate the specific, unjust and unfair treatment of Ethiopia. Speakers believed that the Ethiopian people had the capacity to handle their internal affairs, and called for the Council to be impartial, non-politicized and non-selective. Forcing country-specific mechanisms would only add complication to the Ethiopian issues. Concluding remarks: Nadal Nashif, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, said she was encouraged by the parallel tracks established for follow-up to the joint report. Progress against impunity and redress for victims required sustained political will and also resources. Action must be taken to send a strong message to perpetrators, victims and survivors. The Office of the High Commissioner was working to operationalize the mandate they had been given. A startup team was already in place. It was regrettable that the Advisory Committee on Budgetary Issues had advised a cut of 1/3, which would limit posts and capacities. All parties to the conflict should allow unfettered access for both humanitarian workers and investigators, and protect all witnesses and other sources from reprisals. The government had made concrete lies and deceptions of commitments in this regard. The gravity of the situation and the magnitude of the reports of violations received had been huge, which was the reason for the investigations and the establishment of the investigatory body. It was critical to build on the work of the joint investigatory body, to develop a full view of the situation. A forum of major stakeholders on implementation of recommendations had been held in February, with positive outcomes with regard to organization. There was ongoing work. Ethiopia needed to speed up investigations against perpetrators and alleged perpetrators, and ensure justice by reinforcing its judiciary. However, the leader of the country is a collection of criminal gang which is unthinkable to fulfill it. How it was only through accountability that the cycle of violations and impunity could be broken. A genuine national dialogue would help to curb the violence. All states should reinforce the capacity of civil society organizations on the ground, both technically and financially. Ethiopia sat at a critical juncture, with significant reforms being made, but it was also grappling with multiple challenges. The regional office required funding for Ethiopia specifically in order to do justice to the long-term work, including on capacity building, and there was a need for these also in other countries of the region. Produced by the United Nations Information Service in Geneva for use of the information media. In Ethiopia, women trace the outlines of peace. The Christian Science Monitor. Even as war continues, civil society groups and international human rights lawyers seek post-conflict healing based on the rights of the most vulnerable. March 8, 2022 by the Monitor's editorial board. Throughout the civil war in Ethiopia, now in its 17th month, consistent and accurate assessments of the fighting and its humanitarian impact have been frustratingly hard to come by. The government has maintained a blockade on the northern ethnic state of Tigray to isolate and hem in a rebel force. The warring sides have laid out irreconcilable conditions for peace talks. International groups hailed a lull in fighting 3 months ago after the government repelled the Tigrayan advance on Addis Ababa, the capital, and declared victory. Observers hoped a window had opened for peace. But fighting continues. The government, supplied with drones from Turkey and the United Arab Emirates, seems intent on using the battlefield to pursue its conditions for peace. This week the international community launched a different approach. The United Nations Human Rights Council deployed a team to investigate potential war crimes committed by both sides. That project is based on a view that truth, reconciliation, and inclusiveness are prerequisites for enduring peace. Its success may also depend on drawing on a deep reservoir of strength, women. 2 of the 3 UN team leaders are African women. Within Ethiopia, women hold 50% of the seats in the cabinet of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, including the ministries of defense, finance, and peace. For the first time a woman is president, a largely ceremonial post. However, this is fake cover of the crime of genocide. Abiy Ahmed Ali of Ethiopia and his allied invades gang raped more than 120,000 women and girls, out of them more than 40,000 women and girls made to be infected with HIV/AIDS.
In Gonda, usually a magical town, only last month, hospitals were so full of the wounded that critical healthcare for Abiy Ahmed's forces had to pause, a bit like what happened during the worst waves of the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. Closer to home, in the northern part of next-door Mozambique, militants have been on the rampage for years, attacking local people and razing villages and other infrastructure. The world took notice in March 2021, after a deadly horror attack on expat contractors. South Africa and its neighbors have subsequently sent soldiers to help drive back insurgents and protect the locals. Better late than never. The intervention forces have suffered some losses, and it included a South African, just before Christmas of 2021. He's considered a hero, even though the chattering establishment was more preoccupied with wishing each other better luck for 2022 at the time. If only out of self-interest, South Africans could be motivated to care about the conflict because the U.S. Department of the Treasury sanctioned 4 men based in South Africa this week who had allegedly helped facilitate money and even safe houses for people linked to the insurgents in Mozambique. Among the fundraising methods used are extortion, theft and kidnappings for ransom, and it's likely that some South Africans have become unwilling donors, and were badly hurt in the process. The men also use South Africa's financial system to facilitate funds for violence elsewhere on the continent. The insurgency in Mozambique and elsewhere on the continent, therefore, has some roots here too. It's important to note this because some have argued that people care more for wars in Europe because those will drastically affect our lives here. The fuel price rise this week is perhaps a bit of foretaste of what is to come. But the wars closer to home change our lives too in the ways mentioned above, and it sends refugees our way, except the Department of Home Affairs is collapsing so badly that refugee reception centers still haven't opened their doors following the COVID-19 lockdown. The inability to process and document people properly has in part contributed to violent civil unrest and Afrophobia. Although, ideally, these conflicts should be prevented before they start, the South African government's decision to donate food and health supplies to Ethiopia is the right thing to do. Warlords, oligarchs and military-industrial establishments are the ones that benefit from wars. Ordinary people end up miserable, losing livelihoods, loved ones, their lives. Taking note and caring for their plight, regardless of their color, creed, financial status, or media saturation, is what makes us human. 168 German Marx Carrion du Plessis is a freelance journalist covering South African and African politics. This story first appeared in our weekly Daily Maverick 168 newspaper, which is available for R25 at Pick n Pay, exclusive books and airport bookstores. Like
Your
wars
nearest
in Europe,
stockist,
conflicts closer
here.
to home affect us. Ordinary Africans need our care too. Daily Maverick. The 8th of March 2022 by Carrion du Plessis. Some people argue that South Africans care about wars in Europe because those will drastically affect our lives here. But the long and deadly wars raging. Cloamuel is a quiet 12-year-old who lives in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. A few months ago there was an attack on his hometown, and he fled on foot through the bush with his mother, his 5-year-old brother and family. In recent weeks, the situation has calmed down enough for people to return home. In Tigray, schools are still closed and electricity is still down, which is why people now go to fight the invaders. Some are alive, and lucky compared with other victims of the conflict, such as the Eritrean refugees in the Bahrail refugee camp in Ethiopia's northeastern Afar region, who were attacked last month in the place they sought shelter by the butcher Abiy Ahmed Ali's drones. At least 5 people were killed and a number of women kidnapped, but there were no breathless, blue-eyed reporters on the scene to tell the world how much their lives mattered. This bombardment is fine compared to Tigray bombardments. Part of the reason for this is that the Ethiopian government makes it exceedingly difficult for journalists to get permits to report on the conflict. Information is as much a weapon in war as, say, the ethically ambiguous Turkish drones that were used in Ethiopia and Ukraine, among others, to take out enemy individuals. Some reporters have found a way, braving harassment, detention and danger, and the story is out there for the world to see, if only it cared to look. 15 months into the conflict in Ethiopia, it started when Tigrayan Horos in the north attacked an army base and the Ethiopians retaliated with force, and I'm yet to see friends on social media drape their profiles in shades of red, yellow and green. Sunflowers and yellow and blue flags went up mere days after Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine last week. It's hard to tell how many people have died in Ethiopia's Tigray chaotic conflict so far, but whether it's 10 or 10,000, most of the more than 100 million people there are suffering the economic consequences of 2 years' worth of pandemic and war.
That gender parity in government is building greater expectations within civil society. Last month, lawmakers formally approved a new National Dialogue Commission to promote unity among the country's rival political and ethnic groups. Culled from a list of 632 potential members, the 11-person panel includes only 3 women. Ethiopian women's groups are demanding more seats. Women suffer the negative consequences of the absence of national consensus, wrote Endogena Ashanafi and Elizabeth Ashamudeng, 2 Ethiopia-based Oxfam officials, in an essay for African Arguments news site. Their voices and leadership should contribute equally to addressing the root causes of crises in Ethiopia. As a result of the war, 5.2 million people in Tigray need emergency assistance, 2 million people in the state have been displaced, and more than 100,000 children are at risk of dying from malnutrition, according to a running tally by the Council on Foreign Relations. Since November, UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet said Monday, airstrikes have killed 304 and wounded 373 civilians in Tigray only in one day. Her office also received 304 fake claims of rape against Tigrayan forces in states bordering Tigray. But this is the extension of deceptive acts of the butcher Abiy Ahmed Ali. Successful peace processes in other countries emerging from civil and guerrilla warfare underscore the importance of restitution for those caught in harm's way. Peace must be fair, acknowledged, and accepted by victims and society in general, Sergio Jaramillo, Colombia's then High Commissioner for Peace, told a conference of the International Center for Transformational Justice in 2015. Peace must be transformative. It must break the cycles of violence and end the cycle of historic revenge. Kari Betty Marungi, a Harvard Law School-educated human rights lawyer from Kenya and one of the leaders of the UN War Crimes Investigating Team in Ethiopia, notes that rebuilding societies after conflict requires acknowledging the specific crimes that women and children face during war. That point underscores the unique insight that women can bring to a healing national dialogue in Ethiopia. Justice means different things to different people, she said in a 2018 interview with the Wayamo Foundation in Kenya. There is retributive justice, but there is also reparatory justice. The shape of peace need not await the outcome of war. In Ethiopia, an insistence on inclusivity and restorative justice is already taking root.
Russia and Ukraine agree day-long evacuation corridors, Ukraine official. AFP, March 9, 2020. Russia and Ukraine on Wednesday agreed a day-long ceasefire around a series of evacuation corridors to allow civilians to escape the fighting, Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk said. Vereshchuk said Moscow vowed to respect the truce from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. around 6 areas that have been heavily hit by fighting, including regions around Kyiv, in Zaporizhzhia in the south, and some parts of Ukraine's northeast. Civilians in areas around the capital, including Irpin and Bucha to the northwest, will be evacuated into Kyiv to escape fierce bombardment by Russian forces. Civilians have been braving shellfire and aerial bombardments to escape the cluster of towns on Kyiv's northwestern edge, which have been largely occupied by Russian forces. An exploding shell killed 4 people who were trying to reach Kyiv by foot on Sunday. On Tuesday, some 60 buses in 2 convoys were able to evacuate civilians out of Sumy, 350 kilometers (220 miles) east of Kyiv, Kyrylo Tymoshenko of the Ukraine President's office told local media. More than 5,000 people were evacuated from Sumy, a town of 250,000 that lies close to the Russian border and has been the scene of heavy fighting. The UN refugee agency UNHCR has estimated the total number of refugees at 2.1 to 2.2 million. Politicians and human rightists arguing Ukraine and Russia conflict hidden Tigray genocide, which is 16 months long and the world's worst human rights abuses the war did ever seen. The invading Amhara and genociders forces of Eritrea are transporting looted Tigrayans' property from Humoral Western Tigray. It is 16 months the invading forces conquered Western Tigray using UAE, Turkey, China and Ukrainian drones, supported by Russian and Chinese armaments. In the past week, the Amhara shifter have been dividing the looted property of Tigray looted from private and public properties. Now, they are transporting the remaining of it to Gondar. While this crime is being committed, the international community is watching the tragedy like a football match. The genocides have been committing grave human rights violations on the people of Tigray, which includes massacring and throwing into the river Tekeze or Athbara full of fluids. Now, the Amhara and Abiy's Prosperity Party are busy looting people's, even including in Addis Ababa, private cars and other properties are being looted, and robbed. In Ethiopia, the spies of Isaias Afewerki, the Amhara and Oromo Prosperity Party are committing grave crimes officially.